Welcome to What If Wars. My name is Dan Friedman, and this is my first attempt. The structure of this is going to be briefly giving you an idea of what has been happening with Malta, and then I'm going to be just talking through the different scenarios in 1940, 41, and 42. So just to briefly summarise, Malta is a small archipelago of islands on the African continental plate. The largest of the islands is called Malta. The two other inhabited islands are Gozo and Comino. And in sort of 1937, 1940, it had a population of about 250,000 people on an island about 27 by 14 kilometres. So Malta sits in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's 80 kilometres south of Sicily. It's about 176 miles east of Tunisia, and it's 207 miles north of Libya. You may notice all of those sorts of places seem to be suspiciously under Axis control in around, well, from mid to late 1940. So Malta is best described as having lots of history, and when one looks at that, it seems to be full of lots and lots of invasions. However, what we're actually looking at is many, many centuries, if not millennia, of time with that spread over, and it is, after all, an incredibly attractive place to live, both for its sort of location geopolitically and just generally in the Mediterranean, I'm told. I've sadly not had a chance to go there on holiday, and with COVID at the moment, I'm not sure I will. In the course of all of these sorts of invasions and things, Malta came into British possession in 1800 and became a crown colony in 1813, and from that time until, well, World War II at least, it was the home of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet. The situation with Malta is that it was a vital node in the long lines of communication, the sea lines of communication, SLOC, LOC, lots of acronyms, connecting Britain with a huge amount of the empire. Particularly, it sat right between Gibraltar and Alexandria in the Suez Canal, with access to the Indian Ocean and beyond. And for the first 9 months or so of the war, things seemed fine with Malta. Then France fell and stopped taking care of the Mediterranean, and Italy joined in the war. And things were less good. It was a bit suboptimal, perhaps. So the first what if is, what if Italy had attacked Malta in 1940? They had a plan. They called it DG 10/42, but they felt it would need 40,000 soldiers, the entire Italian Navy, and some 500 aircraft, which they just didn't feel they had to spare. In addition, the Italian leadership felt that they were likely to get Malta as part of a settlement, with Britain seeking terms at any time now, especially now that France had fallen and the Germans were turning their full attention on them. Besides, Mussolini spent the latter part of 1940 looking to try and capture bigger things. In September, they launched an invasion of effectively British Egypt, and then, without having actually reached any conclusion there, invaded Greece in late October. Britain was actually in quite a woeful state in terms of things on Malta. There was a fairly poor garrison. It was an infantry brigade, a few territorial units, and a whole 6 Gloucester Gladiator fighters had actually been uncrated and put together. As a sign of how certain the Royal Navy was with the safety of Malta, the Mediterranean Fleet had been moved in October of 1939, but things seemed okay because until halfway through 1940, the Mediterranean was France and the Marine Nationale's area of responsibility, and Italy hadn't joined the war. In the wider Mediterranean, as well as the attacks by Italy against Greece and Egypt, there were also some slightly inconclusive naval engagements. I think the Royal Navy felt that they were sort of generally coming out favourably. Warspite also managed a notable hit that is thought to be one of the contenders for the longest ever battleship hit, 24 kilometres away, with a 15-inch shell, which is not bad when you think that the flight time will have been about a minute for that. So they'll have had to work out where somebody's going to be a minute later to hit them. Talk about a moving target. So things didn't go as kind of either side planned, really. I mean, certainly I think Britain did not anticipate the fall of France and everything else. But Britain didn't seek terms. Greece didn't fall. North Africa didn't fall. And then at Taranto, the mighty swordfish demonstrated the vulnerability of ships in harbour to attack by aircraft. This was something that actually the Royal Navy had been planning since the end of World War I, when there were plans afoot to try and engage the German high seas fleet at anchor if they wouldn't come out and play. And Taranto is often viewed as being a demonstration for the Japanese of what one could do when attacking a harbour. But just a taster. Then, so that having been 1940, I would say that 1941 starts rather well if you're on the Allied side in the Mediterranean, rather badly if you're Italian. Running through quickly in North Africa, you're driving the wrong way. Greece is a nasty, wintry stalemate full of mountains and snow and Greeks shooting at you, which is really not very nice. And, you know, one expects when one thinks of going to Greece, you know, sun, some pretty ruins, beaches, slightly weird wine, all good things, not snow, mountains, and being shot at. Anyway, and in March, Cape Matapan is another Royal Navy victory, or Royal Navy and bits of Commonwealth Navy victory over the Italian forces again. But things aren't all going the right way, and as early as sort of January, February 1941, you've got the Germans starting to think that they're going to have to tidy things up for the Italians. So the nascent Africa Corps under Rommel starts being sent out in February. And my own take on this is that it's broadly that Germany's trying to tidy everything up before they engage in Operation Barbarossa. So in April of 41, they take Yugoslavia and Greece alarmingly quickly, and then in May, the Bismarck sorties as well, and things are generally looking a bit rough. In fact, to go through what's happening, we've got Malta sitting here in the middle again, and the Royal Navy's been taking definite losses. Greece has fallen. That's not good. The Luftwaffe has come south for the winter, like many migratory birds, and really has had air superiority over Malta, which has been being bombed by the Italians since June. But the Luftwaffe has really been there since January, and things have been building up. In Malta, the garrison is largely unchanged, and the air forces are now a handful of hurricanes, with reinforcements being rushed to Greece and Crete, possibly somewhat unsuccessfully, but never mind. And there's a lot of video already up on the internet and YouTube about the Battle of Crete, what might have been, what should have been, what could have been, and sadly what was. But from Malta's point of view at this stage, you've got a lot of air forces, you've got these elite Fallschirmjäger, the German air attack people. They're known to be in the area, but they haven't yet been deployed, and you don't know what's happening. Fortunately then, the other issue is Iraq is in revolt, it being a British sort of mandate. I found it too amusing to not add that. But fortunately for Malta, and possibly foolishly for the Axis, they attacked Crete rather than Malta, and so you have the fall of Malta. The fall of Crete rather than the fall of Malta. The other places the airborne forces could have gone, it was thought they might even go as far as Iraq, but Malta seemingly wasn't actually on their list of places to go, possibly due to the effects of the bombing earlier in the year, rendering Malta largely ineffective as an offensive base, but nonetheless the reality was that it was a definite threat. It just wasn't something that was taken up by the Axis forces. So what happens after May? Well, the German attention moves to Operation Barbarossa, and for that matter, the Fallschirmjäger are a spent force. Italy really doesn't feel that she's got the equipment, manpower, air power, sea power to take Malta on their own at that point. Rommel is generally distracting everyone and drawing far too much attention to himself in North Africa, and will go on to be a problem. And Malta largely seems to have survived by having been beaten into not being a threat when the Axis plans were drawn up, and the balance of power really shifted, that just as the Axis attention moved away from the Mediterranean in general and thoughts of that, they managed to get additional forces in, which will go on to actually be a bit of an issue in places where the sort of arrival of forces in Malta is not necessarily mean that they are safe. So then through the rest of 1941, you have Malta becoming an increasing threat to the Axis sea lines of communication to North Africa. They make it increasingly difficult for the Axis forces to get their equipment and supplies together for what will be, I think, round 4 of fighting in North Africa, because it was Italy attacks Egypt, Britain attacks Italian bits, Germany counterattacks, yeah, I think 4. Oh, and then there was Brevity, Battle Axe, maybe it's 5? I'm not really sure. But as I say, the opportunity to take Malta had been lost, the forces had been expended elsewhere, the Fallschirmjäger in Crete, and then the mammoth forces sent into Russia, or Soviet Union, or however we're calling them at the moment. So, later on, the Axis forces don't really help themselves, and some of these things, either I could go into quite a bit of detail explaining the rationales and things, or I can resort to emojis to show my feelings about it all. So, the Axis, do a number of things. The entire German high command seems to forget that Russia is big and that Russia gets cold somehow. I don't know how. Rommel shows that he bypassed ever having any staff officer training by starting to repeatedly overextend himself and forget about logistics in places which aren't as small and cramped as northwest France. Italy decides in all their wisdom that with everything that's going on, the best thing they can do is send a force to Russia or Soviet Union, because that's useful. And then just towards the tail end, Japan decides to try and knock America out of a war that they don't even know they're in, and failed. And then Germany decided to declare war on Japan, on America rather. And yeah, I don't know, hence the emojis. But it's not actually all good for Malta and the Allies, really, despite these perhaps self-inflicted problems on the part of the Axis forces. As winter makes flying conditions in the east, on the eastern front, harder and harder, the Luftwaffe once again migrates south for the winter, this time bringing with them newer models of aircraft, like the Bf-109, which are still going up against Battle of Britain era Mark I Hurricanes. And then in late 41, the Royal Navy does not have a good time. In November, Barham and Ark Royal are sunk. In early December, Force Z is sunk by the Japanese. Force K, that had been doing wonderful things for the creation of artificial reefs in and around the Mediterranean, with supplies that the Axis forces have been trying to get to North Africa, run into a series of mines, an Italian minefield laid where they didn't think there would be one. And in another remarkable Italian victory, and I know it's a bit of a sort of a meme or a whatever to take the piss out of the Italians in World War II, and part of me really wants to engage with it and indulge it, and part of me wants to point out that actually they could do some really quite fearsome things, and the small units that undertook operations like placing the limpet mines on Valiant and Queen Elizabeth, that's just bloody impressive, and up there with the attacks on Tirpitz and Operation Chariot and all the other things. So, really good. Just give them a moment. Frickin' awesome. And they took out the 2 battleships that were peers of Warspite in terms of the upgrades and everything to really make them shit-hot 1940s battleships, considering they were laid down before World War I. At the same time, or in the same rough period, 3 of the Royal Navy's aircraft carriers managed to, embarrassingly, one runs into a reef and 2 others managed to run into each other in the mid-Atlantic, all suffering bits of damage that will take a couple of months to knock the dents out of. And you can tell that things really aren't going well when you lose 50 hurricanes on an island as small as Malta in January alone of 1942, and the Germans Luftwaffe had brought some night fighters, and they essentially stopped all of the operations of nighttime bombers and the radar-equipped reconnaissance aircraft or patrol aircraft that had been flying off Malta. They just suffered such heavy losses that they were effectively withdrawn. The final thing in 1941 was Operation Crusader, another of these big slugging matches in North Africa. Had not been as successful as had been hoped, and then, following the exact doctrine that the Germans have been following for an awfully long time, and certainly since World War I, the Rommel counterattacked as soon as he could in January and rolled back across most of what they'd conquered. Admittedly, it was mostly desert, and there are arguments about how useful it is and how much you're just extending your lines of communication, but that's not really the point. So, what's happening with Malta through the first half or so of 1942? Well, some convoys in January get through, but then in February and March, convoys are badly attacked, both at sea, and if they do manage to arrive, they are bombed whilst they're unloading to the point where they just can't get much of the stuff off the ships. So convoys which had been being planned for April and May were cancelled, and a beefed up operation, coordinated, complicated thing is planned for June. But by then, Malta's going to be running really quite short of food, fuel for aircraft, and just everything. This is why, on the 15th of April 1942, King George VI awarded the George Cross to Malta for their bravery in the face of the sustained air attacks. Now, also occurring in early 42, the Italians blew the dust off their plan from back before the war, DG-10/42, for invading Malta. They renamed it C3, C3. If you pay any attention to my pathetic attempts at accents, you'll understand why I'm saying C3. And they had the good fortune that, by this point, Albert Kesselring, who seems to have had his head screwed on fairly well, was recognising that Malta was a threat to the Axis sea lines of communication, and that really trying to take Malta out of the war from the air just wasn't working, and hadn't worked before, was unlikely to work again. So they started talking, and things got passed up the chains to the wonderful, in no way completely unpredictable, and source of so many what-if opportunities, leadership on both of these Axis states. And it also happened to coincide with Admiral Raeder, who had been actually advocating a Mediterranean-focused strategy since 1940, possibly because his sailors were tired of getting cold in the North Sea and sunk. I don't know. So this is where the what-if opportunities really start to appear, I think. As I said, in 1941, I think the Axis had a good chance and probably the best opportunity. They opted for Crete instead. I think that was probably a mistake, but never mind. They weren't asking me, possibly because I'm half Jewish. But in what we've got now is a meeting between Hitler and Mussolini in April 42, where they discuss wide plans, which includes what's going to happen in the Mediterranean. The plan is that in late May, Rommel will attack in North Africa, recapture Tobruk, a vital port, and then stop about there to wait for the logistics to catch up. They need to rebuild the port, get that working again, get supplies across, re-equip, rearm. You know, the tanks are not going to be in great shape. The men need a bit of time. You need supplies. You need everything. All these things that Rommel is so notorious for not caring about or not understanding. In that pause, the air forces can easily shift across and start attacking Malta and support the invasion of Malta, which is going to be undertaken with forces that are on the Italian side of the Mediterranean, so it really sort of gives a good breather for the Axis forces and applies a bit of a 1-2 punch to the Allies. Then Rommel, with better supply lines, can really press on across North Africa, take Egypt, secure Alexandria, the Suez Canal, and really hurt the British and the British Empire and the Allied forces. Now, at the same time all this is happening, Britain, the Allied forces aren't completely static, and they are building things up. There was the size of force on Malta was not huge, particularly the air forces. So even just one new squadron commander being sent out, who'd been flying since the start of the war, had flown through the Battle of Britain, brings the latest air tactics to go to Malta. Then he arrives in about February, and then slowly, gradually, through sort of March, April, May, with a few false starts where the aircraft are shot up as soon as they get to Malta, the Allied forces managed to build up a good number of Spitfires on Malta and really start to turn the tide. So it's slightly tricky to work out the exact figures, but the Luftwaffe forces, in terms of operational aircraft, have gone from starting about 6 months before with 137 109s to 30. They go from 199 operational Ju-88s to 34 by the end of, and all that by the end of May. So it's not ideal, and what this does say is that they're going to need some fresh air forces to really take the fight back to Malta if they want to do anything. But, they now want to. The diminished Malta offensive power allows the Axis forces to build up faster than they had before, and they then get the first punch in the kind of summer fighting of 1942 with the Battle of Gazala. It's a pretty good success, and they, just to sort of put that in context, so that's end of May. Plan is for the air attacks on Malta to start at the end of June, with a notional, the invasion date they've been working towards is the 1st of August. In the meantime, those convoys to Malta I was talking about, which were going to come through in June, a qualified success, shall we say. They took heavy losses, but they did manage to get enough through to keep Malta going. With Gazala, this is kind of what really happened. Tobruk fell on the 21st of June, and Rommel at that point really starts agitating to not have to stop and, get his forces actually back to an operational state. He wants to drive on as quick as he can. And officially on the 21st of June, Operation Hercules C3 was postponed to September, and the whole endeavour was clearly given up by the end of July. The only other thing to note around this is in mid-July, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who commanded 11 Group in the Battle of Britain, was given command of the air forces on Malta, so became the Air Officer Commanding Air Headquarters Malta, because that's not too many confusing acronyms. But just to review this plan, C3 or Hercules, it actually, shockingly for something to do with the Axis forces, had a really good coordinated staff. It was joint, it was German, Italian, it was tri-service. They got input from Japanese experts on amphibious warfare and things. In April of 42, they, after a couple of months, they got Karl Student appointed to command the airborne component, who really was very chastened from what had happened with Crete the year before, and up until then they'd had input from other people who'd done really very well in the fighting on Crete and things to advise on the airborne part. Now, the slight difficulties which I've had are apparently the planned date for the operation was a full moon, and they talk about a full moon in July or around the 1st of August, and I'm not quite sure there is one. So when I was looking, and I'll confess the places that seem to come up with Google when I look up to see where and when the moon is, talk about it seems to all be about astrology stuff, but never mind. So it could have been the 1st of August, it seems, just about. Would have just about worked, or they'd have had to wait a month. This is because the plans were to time the landings so that they would be happening sort of at night in part, and making use of the darkness, but wanting at least some degree of light. Now, one of the key issues around the consideration of Hercules C3 and the decisions to postpone and then cancel it are that taking Malta was a key plank of strategy for the Italians. It was very much part of what they wanted. They wanted to have this new Roman Empire across the Mediterranean. And so having Malta sitting there as an annoying little nugget of resistance really wasn't part of the plan. The Germans, however, really the Mediterranean was a complete distraction, and they just wanted to redeploy forces back to the east and stop having to worry about their other flank, really. That's why when Rommel seemed to be rolling up the 8th Army across June, Hitler and then Mussolini, persuaded by Hitler, seemingly listened. they lived to regret that, as the First Battle of Alamein, which ran through pretty much all of July, turned into a stalemate. But hey, foresight, hindsight, what can I say? I rarely find I agree with the Axis senior leadership on things, but maybe that's just me. So, and just to show, they had got some pretty good plans, and they had learnt from the previous things. It was primarily going to be a amphibious landing, but they were going to use 2 airborne divisions. So the map I put up, which I've kind of tried to nail together from something taken off Google, just shows Malta. The big arrows are the landing sites. The main one is on the southwest corner, southwest coast of Malta. Interesting, it's away from Italy, but also away from Valletta Harbour and the shore defences there. There was the possibility of some landings slightly further around the coast to the east, but wasn't quite clear whether they actually were committed to that or if it was just a feint. They'd planned a number of amphibious feints, which I haven't bothered putting on here. The blue diamonds are the main airfields, just to give an idea of where they are. Certainly, if you read about defence of Malta, they're very important. If you go into more detail, the 4th most northern amphibious landing arrow, is a separate landing on Gozo that was planned to happen at about the same time. And then the 5 little upside down triangles are the airborne landings. The last thing I put on there is a defensive line known as the Victoria Line that ran across Malta. I realised after I drew the map that I used the wrong colour, but really couldn't be bothered to go back and change it. So, never mind. So, what are they going to bring to the party? So the Germans are only really providing 1 division of infantry, the Fallschirmjäger of Fliegerdivision 7, rebuilt after Crete, and they've got a large force of transports. The Italians have got an airborne division, and they've constructed an air landing division as well. It's interesting, the air landing forces really don't seem to get much love during the mythologizing of the war, but the effectiveness of paratroops in undertaking large-scale operations was possibly a bit questionable. They tended to scatter too much. They were wonderful for causing disruption. They were elite, amazingly individually inspired soldiers, huge amounts of bravery, highly trained, not taking any of that away from them. But if you wanted a bit of land taken, actually the air landing forces, who came in the gliders, would land as a formed platoon maybe, would have access to heavier kit, would be able to bring with them at least a few bits of infantry support weapons, so actually they were probably more effective. And then the first wave of amphibious forces was 2 divisions of normal infantry, a mountain division that was assigned to take Gozo. There was a force of Regia Aeronautica forces, which I don't entirely understand why they had infantry who were going to do an amphibious assault, but I'm just going to assume Axis power play military politics. There are about 3,000 San Marco Marines, plus about 300 elite sort of, what's the best way of describing them? Clearance diver, commandos. There were 2,500 black shirts, fascist loyalists, a bit like the SS, sort of thing. Don't know how effective they'd be at actual fighting, probably quite effective at committing war crimes, at a guess. And going in with the first wave, they didn't have any tanks, but they had 27 self-propelled guns. About 2/3 of them were going to have a 47mm anti-tank gun, and the other 8 or 9 were going to be a 75mm mountain gun, although with very limited elevation, operating as an assault gun. There are also going to be 30 L3 tankettes that are probably most easily described as being like a Bren carrier with a tin roof. But, you know, if it's coming towards you and you don't have a tank of your own, even that's going to be a bugger to stop, and it's probably got a machine gun or 2. So, you know, not bad. There was a planned second wave that would be sitting offshore and would be able to come in. That had at least 2 more infantry divisions. It had the rest of the armoured force that was supplying those first forces. It had a load of artillery, and then it had the only other significant German contribution, which was Zwei Kompanie Panzerabteilung ZBV 66. Yeah, you don't want me trying to speak too much more German than that. Which had a mix of captured tanks from the Eastern Front. It had some Panzerkampfwagens 1 and 2, which were the very early war ones. Panzerkampfwagen 1 armed with a machine gun or 2, Panzerkampfwagen 2 with a 20mm cannon. But then there were also some Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs, and I can't help wondering whether the Panzer IIIs might have been the amphibious tanks that were designed and planned for Operation Sea Lion, were then apparently used for some of the crossings of the big rivers in the attacks in Eastern Europe in 1941. If I had access to that, I would use those. Frankly, 20 Panzer IIIs probably not going to be noticed on the Eastern Front, whether they're there or not, but on Malta, that could really swing things. What are they up against? Well, by mid-42, on Malta, there is a garrison of about 26,000 infantry, who are in 4 infantry brigades, made up of 4 battalions from the local Royal Malta Regiment, former territorial unit, 11 battalions of a mixture of different Commonwealth regiments, most British, but all kinds of things. A real hodgepodge of tanks, but again, the point is, a tank, when you don't have one, is really not a fun thing to come across. And against what would be being brought across, given the difficulties of maintenance of probably those Russian tanks and things, it might sound silly, but Matilda 4s, 4 Matilda 2s, hard to stop. They take really quite a bit of stopping with an anti-tank gun. They've got a 40mm 2-pounder anti-tank gun that'll certainly do for some of those Italian and German tanks. You've got the Vickers Mark 6C, which has a couple of machine guns. You've got the Cruiser Mark 4, which I want to say has a 6-pounder gun, 57mm. That'll take out probably anything except the Russian tanks, and hopefully one can rely on poor maintenance for to account for those and create casualties that way amongst them. And 4 cruiser Mark 1s, which had the 2-pounder, the 40mm anti-tank gun. Also on the island, you've got 12th Field Artillery Regiment, who've got 24 of the excellent 25-pounder guns. In a pinch, they'll do in an anti-tank role in direct fire. Also floating around in various garrison posts and coastal artillery units, there are maybe 30 mobile 18-pounder guns that were kind of World War I generation, but nonetheless, it goes bang and then it goes boom, far away, and it'll do something. The key thing, though, is there are at least 5 squadrons of Spitfires on the island, and they had the Spitfire Mark V. They had at least a squadron of Beaufort torpedo bombers and a squadron of the Beaufighter heavy fighters, or night fighters. They were not necessarily going to be having a fun time making that assault against the island, especially because Keith Park is now in charge of the air defences as of mid-July, and he kind of knows what he's doing when it comes to annoying Germans who want to attack and sort of get air superiority to launch an amphibious assault, I think. He actually used a completely different set of tactics to the ones he used at the Battle of Britain. Battle of Britain, he had gone for a very Fabian strategy. He was looking to take a nibble and disrupt the attacks. He would send in the smallest forces he felt he could to disrupt every single attack and to just harry them bit by bit. Very piecemeal, nibbly. On Malta, completely the opposite. He would be sent, if he saw a raid coming in with radar and things, he would get up 3 squadrons of Spitfires, bearing in mind he was used to dealing with the English Channel, 25 miles wide. Now he had, 50 miles of sea to enable him to get his Spitfires up to an interception altitude. The luxury! So he would basically get 3 squadrons of Spitfires up for each raid. One would bounce the escort fighters from out of the sun. One would then attack the close escort or go straight in on the bombers from the same sort of position, whilst the third one took a head-on attack against the bombers and took them that way. And within a couple of weeks in real history, he'd got the Luftwaffe to stop all their daytime attacks. They'd withdrawn the Ju-87s completely and just generally conceded control of the skies. I mean, it had started in May, but then been June and July, this growing strength. And speaking of growing strength, we've got Operation Pedestal arriving in the middle of the month. Now, this is where I think the timing of when the Axis forces are going to land, whether it's the 1st of August or whether it's latter part of August, I think it's really important and really key, because this brought in a lot more fuel and things, which suddenly means that you can mount a lot more strikes from Malta, your unsinkable aircraft carrier, which is good because getting them there cost the aircraft carrier Eagle, which was bad, but never mind. But Malta's now able to block the sea lines but we're now July, just into August. We've now got a thwarted Rommel. He's exhausted his supplies. He's not waited for his logistics to catch him up. He's kind of done the in North Africa at the end of what's become known as First Al Alamein. They probably didn't call it that at the time. Malta was now able to attack their lines of communication, and Rommel made one last attack. He demanded a load of supplies to make this attack. He wanted, X number of tons of ammunition, I think about 2,000 or so, and 5,000 tons of fuel. He got about a quarter of what he asked for because the rest of it was sunk. And as we've talked about before, the Axis side really couldn't replace and replenish their merchant shipping. So each ship sunk was a ship that couldn't really be replaced. On the Allied side, particularly once the Liberty ship started going, if they could save the crew, you'd almost, if a ship was sailing from the North America to Britain and got sunk along the way, if you rescued the crew, they finished the journey with that convoy escort, or whoever rescued them, you sail them back as passengers across the Atlantic, there might well be a Liberty ship ready that was ordered to literally replace the one that was sunk. I mean, it's just crazy building levels. Not for the Axis. And speaking of the amazing American ability to build, and once they get on stream and supply things, what you were starting to get in North Africa was that at the end of first Al Alamein and then this Alam el Halfa and these other battles, you've got short lines of communication from Alexandria and Suez, bringing in things like Sherman tanks, 6-pounder anti-tank guns, stuff that is better than pretty much anything Rommel's got. And the front line is also short, so over the next few months, Montgomery, who will be given command of 8th Army, is actually going to be able to rotate all of the units off the front line, and actually, as well as giving them time to train, actually give them time for a bit of R&R, give them some time at the seaside, give them some time in the brothels of Alexandria, but mainly at the seaside, I think, was what he wanted them to do. But he wasn't ignorant of the fact that they would want to also do other things, probably. He didn't, but, Anyway, so, what if we're talking about this one, the C3 or Operation Hercules, I'm nearly done, I hope. I think the butterfly needs to flap its wings in about mid-June, because that seems to be when Hitler starts getting anxious or having second thoughts about Hercules. I didn't mention it earlier because it was kind of a reversible thing, but in early to mid-June, Hitler recalls Karl Student to Germany and then doesn't let him go back to Italy, which really is probably the sign or the death knell that the operation's off. What needs to happen? Well, somebody needs to control Rommel. That seems to have been nigh on impossible. He seems to have been completely rogue and a complete nightmare to have under your command. It's quite interesting when you read sort of biographies and stories from that other point of view. And then the lunatic running Germany at the time needs to flip a switch a different way, because who knows why he made any of his decisions. Do I think C3 would work? I don't know. Helpful. Honestly, I think not. The reason for that is because by late July, the Axis forces had lost their superiority so badly, I don't think they'd have got it back, even with kind of shifting the air forces from North Africa to where they weren't doing that brilliantly. shifting those forces across, I think they kind of lost the edge, and I think it would be a real struggle for them to get the air superiority back and keep it for long enough to make the attack. Do I think they'd have made the attack anyway? Well, from what I can tell, the staff who planned the operation actually seem to have been good staff officers, sensible, recognised limitations, learnt from mistakes, took advice, worked together. I mean, it's shocking. It's like it wasn't the Axis. I think they would in all probability have pulled the plug. The question is, would they have been allowed to? They were commanded ultimately by lunatics who gave nonsensical orders about sort of no retreat from El Alamein to Rommel, no retreat from Stalingrad. I'm just so stupid. Never mind. You're not here to hear me witter on about that. But that's basically what I think would happen. Hopefully the information is all in here for you. There are some good resources out there on this if you want. There's some good Wikipedia pages. There's also some research papers that have been done. It's not quite as big an interest as some operations to historians, but there's one or two. There's a particularly good assessment and analysis of this done by an Italian officer as part of going through the US Army's staff college. So his report was very helpful in going through this. And there's also things like the official history of World War II of the British Army and Royal Navy and Royal Air Force and things. Those are excellent resources for this, and all of these things are available for free with a little bit of searching around. And I don't mean by that that I went off and found illegal copies of things. I mean by that these things have been kindly made freely available by academic institutions and things for the benefit of everyone. So, what ifs? Useful for recognising that history isn't inevitable, useful for trying to avoid the terrible temptations when looking at history of going, but I know X. I know what happened. But what might have happened? What would you have done in a different circumstance? What might have happened and how might that have worked? And that then can help you to learn more from history, I think. What becomes difficult, and this is where I don't like alternate history so much, or at least not as a historical endeavour. It can be quite amusing and entertaining as a source of fun and fiction, is when you take it too many steps beyond. What I'm doing is I'm trying to present the history, what happened, up to a decision point where I think things could have gone multiple ways, and I'm trying to give you the information, or I'm trying to think about through the information about where things were at that point, what might have decided it. In this case, I think it's a battle of attrition, which means it's a battle of logistics. There is this wonderful saying, amateurs study tactics, fanboys study the numbers and tanks and things, and generally get far too excited about German equipment, and professionals study logistics. I'm a rank amateur, but I'm getting interested in this when I start to look. But, you know, what do I know? I'm just a weirdo on the internet.